The drone carrying a laminated cease and desist letter crashed into my kayak with all the grace of a drunk goose landing on ice. As the little machine sputtered and sank into the crystal-clear water of my lake, I looked up to see Patrice Van Doren, HOA president of the neighboring Willow Hills community, standing on the opposite shore. She wore her signature monogrammed windbreaker and held a bullhorn that probably cost more than most people's car payments. Through the megaphone, she screamed with a voice that could shatter glass, "You are trespassing on HOA-controlled waters. This is your final warning." I gave her a friendly wave. She screamed even louder, her face turning the same shade of red as her perfectly manicured nails. "The thing is, I own this lake. Every single drop of water, every fish swimming beneath the surface, and every grain of sand along its shores belongs to me, Miles Rennick. Let me back up a bit. I'm 51 years old, and I spent most of my career as a civil engineer designing flood control systems that nobody ever appreciated until Mother Nature decided to throw a tantrum. After 3 decades of thankless work and one particularly nasty storm that proved my design saved half the county from becoming an impromptu swimming pool, I decided to retire early. With my savings and a decent pension, I bought what I thought would be my peaceful paradise, a secluded house on Lake Tannen Ridge, complete with 8 acres of pristine land, a charming boathouse that needed some work, and most importantly, the legal deed to the entire lake itself. The lake ownership was the result of a bizarre foreclosure auction that involved a bankrupt resort developer, 3 competing bidders who all thought they were buying something else, and one very smug real estate lawyer who assured me that yes, I would indeed own every square inch of water and the land beneath it. The previous owner had consolidated all the parcels decades ago for a failed luxury resort project, and when it went belly up, the whole thing went up for auction as a single lot. Enter Patrice Van Doren, a woman whose blonde bob was so perfectly styled it could probably survive a Category 5 hurricane. She ruled over the Willow Hills HOA with an iron fist wrapped in a pastel-colored glove. Her neighborhood wrapped around the eastern side of my lake like a crescent moon, with about 40 houses that all had what the real estate listings called stunning lake views. But here's the kicker, not a single one of those properties actually owned any lakefront land. That sweet stretch of beach and water they all enjoyed looking at? That belonged to yours truly. This arrangement had apparently worked fine for the previous owner, who'd abandoned the property years ago and never bothered anyone. But Patrice had grown accustomed to treating the lake like her personal kingdom, and my arrival threw a wrench into her carefully controlled world. The trouble started innocently enough when I installed a modest wooden dock and began hosting quiet canoe meetups with a few friends from my engineering days. We'd paddle around, drink coffee from thermoses, and discuss the finer points of hydraulic engineering. Wild stuff, I know. But apparently, this was too much excitement for Patrice to handle. Within a week, I received an official-looking complaint from something called the Lakeside Beautification Committee, which I later learned didn't actually exist. She'd created fancy letterhead and everything. The complaint stated that my dock violated established aesthetic standards for shared water features, and demanded I submit plans for HOA-approved modifications. I responded by sending her a copy of my deed, highlighted in bright yellow marker for easy reading, along with a friendly note explaining that I owned the lake and could build whatever I pleased on my property. She escalated faster than a rocket heading for orbit. First, she hired a group of teenagers to place signs around the waterline that read, "Private HOA Lake, Residents Only." I removed them and kept them as souvenirs. Then she mailed me a $400 fine for non-resident use of community resources. I framed that one. It hangs in my bathroom now. But Patrice wasn't done. She reported me to the county for unauthorized fish stocking, claiming I was destroying the lake's ecosystem. The county inspector who came out literally laughed when I showed him my ownership papers and explained that I hadn't added any fish. I was just feeding the ones already there. He stayed for coffee and we had a nice chat about bass fishing. The real circus began when Patrice established what she called the HOA Aquatic Patrol. Picture this, a single paddleboat with a laminated logo duct taped to the side, manned by 2 retirees named Harold and Eugene. They'd been convinced by Patrice that they were protecting community property from a dangerous squatter. These poor guys would circle my dock every morning like they were guarding the Pentagon, armed with nothing but matching polo shirts and a pool noodle that Patrice had painted to look like some sort of official baton. I tried to be nice. I really did. I even offered Harold and Eugene lemonade one particularly hot afternoon, explaining that they were welcome to paddle around but they should know they were technically on my private property. Eugene seemed to understand, but Harold just muttered something about HOA regulations and paddled away faster, which in a paddleboat is still pretty slow. Things reached a boiling point on the 4th of July. I decided to throw a small barbecue for some friends and family, maybe 20 people total. We grilled burgers, played cornhole, and as the sun set, I launched exactly one firework over the water. It was completely legal. I'd even checked with the fire department beforehand and gotten written permission. The firework bloomed into a beautiful red, white, and blue chrysanthemum pattern that reflected off the lake's surface like a mirror. Patrice absolutely lost her mind. Within minutes, she had called 911, claiming that a militia naval operation was taking place on HOA-controlled waters. She used words like invasion and hostile takeover, with such conviction that the dispatcher actually sent 3 squad cars and a sheriff's boat that they had to trailer in from the next county. When Sheriff Deputy Martinez arrived, I was ready. I handed him a binder I'd prepared labeled Tannin Ridge Lake, Deeded Ownership, Legal Access, and Fishing Rights. It had colored tabs, highlighted sections, and even a table of contents. The deputy flipped through it, occasionally whistling at particularly interesting passages. After about 10 minutes, he closed the binder, looked at Patrice who had followed him onto my property, and said with barely contained amusement, "Ma'am, this gentleman owns your swimming view. Every bit of it." Patrice's face went through more color changes than a chameleon at a rainbow convention. She accused me of forging the documents, claimed the county records were wrong, and even suggested that the sheriff was in on some elaborate conspiracy. Deputy Martinez, who had the patience of a saint, simply escorted her back to her HOA-issued golf cart. As she drove away, I could hear her muttering something about maritime sovereignty and constitutional lake rights, neither of which are actual things. But I was done playing defense. It was time to establish some boundaries, literally and figuratively. I hired a lawyer, not to sue anyone, but to properly enforce my property rights. Within a week, professional signs went up around the lake perimeter. They read, "Private lake, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. Drones will be treated as hostile aircraft." That last part was mostly a joke, but Patrice didn't need to know that. I also sent formal cease and desist letters to every Willow Hills resident I documented kayaking, swimming, or fishing past my property line. The letters were polite but firm, explaining the situation and offering to discuss reasonable access arrangements with anyone who approached me respectfully. Most people were shocked to learn they'd been trespassing for years. Several apologized and asked if we could work something out. But Patrice doubled down like a gambling addict at a casino. She spent $7,000 of HOA funds hiring someone she found on the internet who claimed to be a property rights specialist, but turned out to be a guy named Brad who made websites from his mom's basement. Brad's investigation concluded that my deed was suspicious based on absolutely nothing, and his report was so poorly written that my lawyer actually laughed out loud while reading it. The county records office, tired of Patrice's constant visits and demands to see the real documents, finally issued a formal statement confirming that I was indeed the sole owner of Lake Tannin Ridge and had been since the date of purchase. They even included a map with my property outlined in red, showing how it carved into the Willow Hills development like a bite out of a sandwich. The residents of Willow Hills were starting to notice that their HOA fees kept increasing while the services decreased. The flowers at the entrance looked half dead, the playground equipment hadn't been updated in years, but somehow Patrice had money for lake-related legal battles that she kept losing. People started asking questions at the monthly meetings, but Patrice would shut them down with references to ongoing litigation and confidential HOA business. The truth came out when a resident named Sandra, who happened to be a forensic accountant, did some digging. She discovered that Patrice had been collecting a lake maintenance fund fee from every household for the past 8 years, accumulating nearly $200,000 that was supposedly used for lake upkeep and improvements. The problem: the HOA had never owned the lake and had no right to collect fees for maintaining it. A special HOA meeting was called, and due to a court order related to the financial investigation, it had to be open to all interested parties. I showed up with a presentation I'd been preparing for weeks. As residents filed into the community center, I handed out laminated waterproof copies of my lake deed to everyone who walked through the door. The title of my slideshow, displayed on a screen I'd brought myself, read, "How I Became Your Overlord, The Legal Saga of Lake Tannin Ridge." For 45 minutes, I walked them through the entire timeline, from my purchase of the property to Patrice's increasingly desperate attempts to claim ownership of something that was never hers. I showed receipts for the sign she'd had made, the invoice from Brad the specialist, and email exchanges where she discussed plans to drive out the interloper using HOA resources. The room was silent when I finished, except for the sound of Patrice's perfectly manicured nails clicking against the table in front of her. Then Sandra stood up and presented her findings about the missing lake funds. The room erupted. People were shouting about lawsuits, demanding refunds, and calling for Patrice's immediate removal from the board. The vote to censure Patrice was unanimous except for one vote, hers. She was stripped of her title effective immediately and ordered to return all HOA property, including the golf cart with HOA President painted on the side. As she stood to leave, someone in the back shouted that they'd seen her slash her own golf cart tires in the parking lot rather than hand over the keys. Security footage later confirmed this was true. But I wasn't done. As the new interim board tried to restore order, I made an announcement. Every Willow Hills resident would receive 30-day grace access to the lake under my new rules. The rules were simple: no drones, no fake patrols, and absolutely no one named Patrice Van Doren was allowed to hold, own, or operate a bullhorn within 500 feet of my property. The aftermath was swift and brutal for Patrice. She was ordered to pay back $78,000 in misappropriated HOA funds, faced 3 years of probation for fraud, and was banned from serving on any HOA board in the state for life. When the judge read the sentence, Patrice stood frozen in the courtroom, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, unable to form a single word of protest.